I wanted to ask you, Michael, because you've done so much work on the U.S.-Cuba relations and also what U.S. policy has been in light of the terrorism. I mean, how do you put this in the context of U.S.-Cuba policy? You know, United States policy toward Cuba and our policy of fighting terrorism in the same bag, you know?
Mel Brooks said about promoting movies, it's all about merchandising. And for the United States government, it's all about private property. The revolution in Cuba took place in 1959. In 1960, shortly after the revolutionaries marched into Havana, the first thing they did was they nationalized vast property holdings. And they offered to pay the owners for it. This is legal under international law. And they would pay them according to how much they evaluated this property for tax purposes. The owners didn't want to take the money. So they nationalized the property anyway, and they distributed it to the poor peasantry of Cuba. In retaliation, the United States refused to refine oil in the refineries they owned in Cuba. So the Cubans nationalized the oil refineries. Then they nationalized the nickel mines. Then they nationalized the telephone company. This is a social revolution, not just a democratic revolution like you've had in Egypt, but a social revolution where a different class takes over the property. It's all about property. And the terrorist campaign that's been going on since 1960 to date is all about property. The United States wants to get that property back. That's what we're talking about. When the Soviet Union went under, the Cuban economy suffered because it lost its lifeline. And that's when they started trying to get tourists to come, particularly from Canada, to have an infusion of money into the Cuban economy. And that's why Posada Carrillas and the others thought that with this terrorist campaign against tourists, they could cut off that new income stream. The Cubans went to the United States government and they said, stop this. For one thing, it's illegal. It violates your own Neutrality Act. You can't carry on armed adventures against a country with whom you're at peace. It's against the law. The United States government refused to stop it. So that's when the Cuban government sent the Cuban Five into Miami to infiltrate these terrorist groups, which they did, and they compiled huge dossiers on who was doing this. And they turned, this was their mistake, because they had a notion that somehow there was some good faith on the part of the United States government. That's a mistake. It's always a mistake. And they turned these dossiers over to the United States government and said, here's who's doing it, arrest them. What did the United States government do? They figured out who the Cubans were that were in Miami, and they arrested them. Those are the Cuban Five. And they tried them in Miami, where you can't get a fair trial.
Whistleblowers.
And convicted them and put them in prison. The interesting thing about the Posada Carrillas trial now is that there's a bit of a change in American policy because they're allowing the prosecutor to work with the Cuban police. They've brought in the main detective from Havana who investigated the murder of this Italian tourist. Well, that's a hopeful sign. But the Cuban Five case is all about trying to prevent terrorism launched from Florida against the Cuban Revolution. It's all about private property.
It's scary. I mean, of course, I know that most of you now know that we were also the victims of terrorism. But for those of you who don't know, the center opened its doors in 1972, in May of 1972. And in March of 1973, one of these counter-revolutionary terrorists put a huge plastic bomb in the center while I was working there and blew the whole place up. So we have a kind of you know, as a survivor, you may interview me if you like, as a survivor and a very angry survivor, I feel that this is something that the U.S. government has never paid enough attention to. I mean, the FBI came to interview me, and I called our lawyers and said, you know, do I let them in the door? And they said, oh yes, you have to think of this as, in this case, you have to think of the FBI as your friend who's going to try and find out who did this dastardly act. And so I said, may I record the conversation? And he said, yes. And so I sat there with a tape recorder on my lap. I didn't show it to him, you know. It was on my lap. And they started asking questions. You know, and before I knew it, they were asking not about our bombing, but they were asking about bombings on the West Coast. They were asking about people who were in the Venceremos Brigade. They were asking about people who were friends of Patty Hearst. And finally I said, really, you know, what does this have to do with our bombing? And one of the FBI agents said, well, as you know, all bombings are related. And I said, no, they're not. End of interview. And I stood up, put the tape recorder, and I said, you're taping this? I said, yes, our lawyers told us I could. And they walked out, and we never heard from them again. But that was the sum total of the involvement. And when we finally got our Freedom of Information papers, not because we asked for it, but someone else did, and it turned out that they had, as did press people, and everyone except us and our lawyers, and no one ever published it. They had, you know, Alpha 66 had, or Omega 7, forget which one, had taken credit for the bombing. They had sent a letter to the AP. The AP had given it to the police. Nobody told us. Nobody told us. I found out 30 years later, when it was quite irrelevant. But
Do you still have the tape? Do you still have that tape?
Oh, I doubt it. we have so many thousands of tapes. I know, it would have been.
What a unique opening for a film.
We only recently discovered a video that had been made by Downtown Community TV the day after the bombing when we were cleaning up. So we do have that. You'll see a little bit of it in Saul Landau's new film about the Cuban Five.
He's supposed to send me a copy. The American government recognizes at a fairly high level that these are terrorists. The forgotten terrorists, I call him, Orlando Bosch, who is just as has been as active as Posada Carreras, but he's sort of the forgotten one. He came into the United States illegally.
Because he's a doctor. He's a pediatrician. That makes it okay.
He came back to the United States illegally in whatever, I'm not sure the year. And at the time, the U.S. government, either the State Department or the Justice Department, designated him as the hemisphere's most dangerous terrorist. And he came in illegally, and this was during his immigration process. Well, the governor of Florida pardoned and allowed Orlando Bosch to come into the United States legally. So the government knows, the government recognized,
Yeah.
and they just said, well, we'll ignore it, we'll let him in. And now, I mean, Orlando Bosch is very well connected with the Bush family, and they do have special days for him. And he's a painter too, and he sells his paintings, and he's considered a hero.
They're both painters, right?
Yeah.
He raised some real money.
What about all the attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro? Do you think this was something that the U.S. government thought was fine? Was that something that we were behind?
Policy. It was U.S. policy.
Yeah, let me speak to that. There have been over 600 documented attempts to assassinate Castro.
Did you see that BBC? That was the BBC documentary. 643 ways to kill Castro.
Yeah, or humiliate him, and just by luck, and also the good work of the Cuban intelligence. They've been able to spare him so far. The same is true of Che Guevara. Michael Ratner and I have a book coming out in June called Killing Che, How the CIA Got Away with Murder, where we got the documents from a FOIA request. We document that the operation to murder Che was organized right out of the White House. So this is a murderous government, and I would encourage everybody to get this book and bring it home and tell people about it. It documents it, and it takes the floor right out under from any of these humanitarian pretensions that this current administration has.
It also puts in context why the Cuban Five were in Miami in the first place. Unless you understand the history and the specifics of this long unknown war, it's hard to put in context why the Five were there in the first place.